Hello everyone, today we talk about Kazakh warriors from the 12th and the 13th centuries for our historical military units series. Kazakh is a synecdoche in this case, comprehending, say, it can be the Cumans, the Pechenegs, the same Kazakhs, by the ethnic ones. Today we will not make too many ethnic distinctions because that's exactly how essentially these terms were at a point used, mostly from the context that now we see this unit from, that is the Russian one, right? We already made an abundant number of videos, also recently, about Russian warfare, pointing out the auxiliary role that these Turks had in Eastern Europe, as it could have been otherwise, especially in those frontier areas with the steppe. Recently we also talked about the Kievan Principality and just the strategic capacity of projection over part of the steppes of the areas. This is what I never tired myself of remembering it. Imagine all what the Russians have occupied right now. Well, that's exactly the line that historically was followed. Like, that was the steppe area, like the nomads or semi-nomads inhabited, and then there is a harder stock of the hinterland, right? When you look at the map of Ukraine, and in many ways this is fascinating because you have quite direct visual understanding of the width of the spaces of the open grounds, and why, of course, these mostly, say, when looking at the proportion of heavy and light, mostly in fact light horse archers were useful, right? And the reason being, we know that socially speaking, that in the steppe there wasn't too much surplus, except for like a very good, actually, but also very narrow, numerically heavily armored elite, mostly having some sort of ethnic background, meaning, you know, the stock that had crushed other tribes and had basically despoiled them of their wealth, and therefore, say, lording over them and having them serving as auxiliaries in this, in fact, properly support function for the heavies, right? And this, of course, is, say, this divide is amplified compared to the center world, given, in fact, the poverty of the steppe in general. And here, we don't even take, again, the geographical dimension in consideration, because this type of warrior can be found up to Central Asia and beyond, right? I already made a video, which, if I'm not wrong, is exactly, like, if not the say, name equivalent to this, because it's not the heavy Kazakh, it's something like the Western European steppe warrior or something, from the, in fact, the same 12th, 13th century for the historical region series. We highlighted, in fact, in that case also what kind of a heavier equipment looked like. Last year I made, I still technically have to finish it, the Eurasian steppes warfare series that shows you how these guys sort of transformed, like, even if gradually, right, throughout the centuries, and how, of course, here we arrive at the 13th century, the Mongol invasions caused a lot of issues. But it's also important to stress, in fact, how close these guys actually were to already the Mongols. The other day we were talking about the Karakitai, for example, and we've seen how these were essentially a Mongol people that ruled as far as parts of the Khwarezmian Empire, and had already, like, influenced the warfare of these sort of Western Eurasian peoples that, again, however, were quite mobile, right? And you could have found employed as mercenaries very, very far away. I made a video about the Alans, for example, that are Indo-Europeans. Yes, they had survived at the foothills of the Caucasus in the northern part, and you find them as bodyguards of the Mongol Chinese, still in the 13th to 14th century. So you can imagine, like, all these other guys that we do not know too much about because they are not particularly documented. They didn't write, of course, but they were also very scattered. We have great difficulties even in sort of tracing, like, in time and space, what kind of groups existed, right? Because, of course, like, especially from, like, during the 20th century, lots of things changed, deportations, war, like, everything sort of remolded, especially during the Soviet Union. But the Tsarist Empire did its own share of massacres. What these kind of groups really are, so that there are actually names surviving, like saying that people is, I don't know, it's the Kazakhs specifically, but of course, like, they're mostly, think about the Tatars, right? It's just a name, and you find people with an extremely mixed background, not just as it would have been at the time, but properly because they were recomposed without properly any capacity of tracing their ancestry, even what happened to them a couple of generations ago. This is sadly true, actually, because of communism in some parts of Central, even, not just Eastern Europe, right? For literally, we do not even know how some major centers were repopulated at some point after World War II and so on. You can imagine for Eurasian steppes across the millennium. But as I was saying before, like, this analysis is facilitated by the fact that the material culture was very homogeneous overall. Like, the ways these guys fought was pretty much the same, right? There was an important variation in the steppes in terms of wealth concentration. If you watch that video about, I think, the Eurasian steppes during the Mongol era, how there were literal pockets of actually quite progressed, advanced semi-nomadic populations that had even a superior material culture than the Mongols, and some sort of interesting technological advancements. The Mongols were, they, of course, overwhelmed them, but they were also much more primitive in many ways. And the story we have observed in general is that the Mongol invasions brought to this sort of further actual weakening of the average, in this case, Turkic warrior capability. The age of the Turkic steppe, that, as you know, begins from essentially late antiquity, with the collapse of the Indo-European ruled one, is also, in fact, of one of, like, the broader migration era of general collapse, right? Yes, these peoples took over, they were more brutal, more primitive, but also in this sense were more backwards, and they were less stable and less affluent to a degree. And so the idea that, for example, the passage from the straight, double-edged sword to, like, the saber, right, and it reaches its peak in Mongol times, the main reason being that actually the saber is paradoxically easier to use than those more advanced sort of knightly swords. Of course, this has nothing to do with the fact that there are sabers that are massive things that retain that impact capacity and all the incredible skills that were necessary to handle them. But overall, right, the point I was making is that the Indo-Europeans had sort of more evenly distributed wealth also in the steppes, and so they tended to have also more cohesion, more compactness at the beginning of their era. The Turks, the Mongols later, instead, yes, have these clamorous waves of conquest with Genghis Khan, etc. But as you understand, also historically in the steppe, it's not that they ever achieved more than much. Like, if anything, it's like their offspring based on a pre-dressed, like, regional basis that it can be, I don't know, China, Iran, etc. Like, that managed to accomplish something also on that basis on sort of the longer run, when their empire had collapsed. And this is not, of course, also to downplay the massive forces that were agitating within these peoples and the capacity to create these empires that is utterly astonishing. But in the case of these 12th, 13th century, say all these peoples from mostly like the Khazars are the fall of the Khazars at the hand of the as a state fundamentally at the hand of the Cuman Rus is perhaps the best chapter. That gradual gentrification of some Turkic populations. There were lots of Indo-Europeans mixed, but again, the ethnic divide there is measured juridically, right? It's those other populations had been subsumed from quite a long time. But the sense is that even compared to Eastern Europe, that wasn't particularly sparking for distinguished political stability, right? They were, of course, like the softer, underbelly like the steppe really is, like in Eurasia as such, except you can't really set foot there with much chances of settling down. In fact, that's how the Cubans actually operated. They had sort of ambiguous relations with these peoples because mostly they couldn't really stabilize them in all their clanic and tribal feuds. But as long as you could garrison some heavies on specific, for example, ports, like at the river mouth or along particularly strategic locations, the same Kiev had largely been fostered by probably being a Khazar avampost, like probably with the Islamic world back in the day. You could simply not control those areas because there is technically nothing there to control, like nothing useful, except of course you can co-opt these guys in large groups, also because they're cheap, right? I made multiple videos about Byzantine auxiliaries exactly of this stock. They're basically all alike, right? The Byzantines had also a much older history of this type of horse archer, like auxiliary, being gradually, actually becoming gradually the easiest one to find, especially in the Komnenian era, as we've seen. Everything gets privatized in the empire, and there is this ultra hardcore of quite functional Constantinopolitan army, but you can hire so many of these for almost nothing. In fact, they're not that dramatically useful overall. Naturally, today we make a bit of history of that's always how it ends up for the steppe, like of the heavier guys, because not just they are basically the only thing that we find in terms of burials, etc., but they're literally sort of the most distinguished type of warrior that you can find. Among them, the one you can appreciate those that aforementioned sort of arms and armor development, and appreciating especially the width of their employment. Like when you think about the Middle Ages, high medieval warfare, you don't really, like, you have lots of ideas of what that was, the Age of Crusades, etc., but the Western heavy trooper, when we look at Eastern Europe, there are quite fascinating styles, etc., but you rarely think about either the humble. You can't even say file in rank because these guys didn't have a close formation, right, in the, say, at least the lighter type Kazak, right, so-called, and yet they were a much more typical anthropic type, militarily speaking, that would go on, like, conceptually up to the end of the Middle Ages, also with a, purposefully successful fashion for what their role technically was. And we've seen, again, we will talk about, for example, more specific ethnic groups at some point. For example, the Cumans are very, like, I don't know, in Hungary, in Germany, they were famous mercenaries. They're depicted in also much art, right, and they're a bit more characterized, right. They would have actually been the same of these guys to some extent. Just local art depicts them in different ways at different times, but they're still part of this broader world of the steppe that comes very, very, very close to us, right, up to the Danube, up to the Pannonian Basin. That was also where many were settled by the Hungarians, as you know, to counter the power of the Magyar ethnic nobility. There are similar phenomena, like, scattered here and there. The traces of these guys are actually very close. We've seen how with the Karakitai, within the Mongol armies, we have evidence of like names of traces up to Moldova, for example. These are actual Mongols, right? So to a degree, it's insane how much we neglected them, and how many, I would say, were actual Europeans, because, as I was saying before, the ethnogenesis, for example, of the Tatars, right? I've seen it for the Lipka ones, right, that ended up serving Poland, Lithuania in a traumatically as fanatically loyal way throughout almost their entire existence. they had been born from this side of the Urals, right? So of course, yes, they weren't, their ethnicity was quite blended, whatever, but it's still like in the broader picture, like a type of identity that is much closer to Europe than we tend to think when you look at longer time. In fact, there was a term that the Russians used to define these guys that is quite fascinating. It sounds like svoi pogania, that means our own pagans. This term was coined, or at least it became more prevalent, obviously, when the Mongols came around. Right? The idea is that the Eastern Slavs had, not just them by the way, had been historically acquainted with these populations from immemorable time, and this is like the next door neighbor, right? You know that you live in the forest, you have like this agricultural life in the in the valleys, you have like a sedentary lifestyle. You know that when the steppe begins, those guys live out there with the tents, their cattle, they move. There's something else, right? And they're usual in that landscape also because, by the way, the Eastern Slavic warfare and the sort of the Western Turkic one get pretty much intertwined, right? If you look at the influence on the Kievan panoplies, for example, and also how you think like the massive, to say the least, influence that the Mongols had in the genesis of the Muscovy, etc. Like you realize that they were really, even after the Mongols arrived, their own pagans. Also considering that actually when we look at the Mongols, the Golden Horde, etc., and other groups, they still subsumed these Turks. Yes, some went as far as we've seen, like Poland, etc. They escaped the Mongol ways, but in many ways that they remained there at a point. It wasn't also too much that the Mongols could do to simply dislodge them, and nor it made a lot of sense, because the reason why an empire existed in the steppe is not covering land, it's covering land with people that can support you on that land, right? And yes, you can, of course, cause an ethnocide of some sort, there is some rebellion, whatever, but these people are better alive, right? You can't, yes, when they're taken out, take their pastures and settle in your own, but to an extent you need somebody there, right? These people subject to you, and you can be co-opted into an advance further west. As it keeps going on, we've seen it very often, for example, in Ottoman times, when the Tatars, constituted like 2/5 of the Ottoman armies, right, just for looting and pillaging, right? You realize that this thing went on forever. And the Rus makes really considerable year at this point of Turkic auxiliaries, right? Their own pagans, as they were called. The term already existed before the Mongol invasion to differentiate these peoples from the wild Turks, as they were called, of the outer steppe, let's say, and like the divide is not clear, telling you the truth. We do not have enough sources to really understand what in a Russian mentality like that further divide really was, especially before the Mongol invasion. And they were quite involved, by the way, into the same Russian endemic civil wars, right? We have seen part of these and how, in fact, important these guys were in like supporting this faction or the other within the same Rus. We'll keep talking about, I don't know, Chernihiv, for example. We still lack some element to sort of at least complete the full picture of the Russian Palatinate in for the historical region series. But it's obvious that if you're a Russian prince and you are overthrown, you're coming to rule on another city and whatever, if you can succeed in mobilizing these Turks from the steppes and saying, look, if you support me, I will reward you with other land, pastures, or at least I will we'll find a deal, right? We will allow you just to loot, because actually what these guys were most into was really that, right? Not being able to grow much in their own places. They focused on loot. So if you gave them green light, right, you could make them great friends, at least for a while. And then you had at some point also to dislodge them in some way. And of course, they do not have the upper hand. The sedentary world is always stronger. The Rus is like also the Mongols, that they are right to subject most of the Rus. But it's not like they directly control it, right? These are just end up to be tributaries, and the Mongols are just in the steppes. That's where the pastures are, their oil fields. And it doesn't matter how close Eastern, like the Slavic world, the Eastern Slavic world is there, right? The Mongols have a great capacity of projection into the Danube, the Balkans. We will see this at some other point at the beginning of Central Europe proper, but there are some areas where they sort of penetrate, even just in war bands, in pockets, right? But they're present, they're constantly there. They do not really control, they do not have the cultural tools to be able to rule over a sedentary world, right? Unless they become fully, like, look at the Ilkhanate, that at least has some areas of Iran being sort of, semi-nomadic, but fundamentally installing themselves in the central rule of a territorial state, like the Persian one had remained after the Mongol conquest, mostly. So that's why this history is interesting, because the mobility of these warriors is insane. If you look at the Ukrainian steppe, or even further out there, this is the place where the Caucasus, where lots of people were properly deported, like they were captured, enslaved by these same nomads and sold as, for example, Mamluks. All right, those would be hired and brought to Egypt and Syria and being transformed into, as you know, the military, the ruling caste, right, of the Egyptian Sultanate. And we have seen this quite often. So there are so many connections, and lots of these guys again are Turkic, but many are also Slavic. Many are also Iranian, like other Indo-European groups, and God knows, like we categorize, of course, the difference, but like in strictly genetic terms, okay, we can imagine like what Western Eurasia really was after all those waves from millennia, right? Peoples like coming, going, and clashing, and and killing and enslaving and raping and whatever. So that's also quite interesting picture. I made multiple videos, by the way, on the region, right? I think we have to make still the series about the Western steppes, if I'm not wrong. Maybe we made it already, because I make so many sometimes that well, no, I think we still have to do. We made the Eastern Eurasian steppes, but yes, we have to see this one regionally more in depth. But I mean, I made the Volga Bulgars, I made the Rus, I made Georgia. So it's like we talk about the islands, etc. So it's like an area we're going to cover, even though in between there is technically steppes. So it's again, it's always the same problem. What you have is these type of guys. Now, the reason why I called them Kazakhs here is that they were literally referred as such, which is, of course, a connection with the former Khazar Khaganate. This is plausibly the same name that would be applied to the later Cossacks that, as you know, were at large also actually and formerly sedentary Slavs that sort of, because of all these waves, especially in the late Middle Ages, turned to a semi-nomadic lifestyle, right? And albeit being sort of ethnic Indo-Europeans. And there is all a terminological history, and it can be seen as an anti-establishment simple, like etymologically, like nomad, vagabond, freebooter, like the sense of, as you know, the Cossacks of Zaporizhia, for example, it would turn into veritable pirates. Like there would be people from all over Europe who, when exiled, persecuted, whatever, they would start their piratic lifestyle there, and these guys were also employed in part by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth army, and so the famous registered Cossacks, for example, that had properly a peasant, military colonist status of some sort within the Rzeczpospolita, which would continue, in fact, also with the aforementioned tradition of the Lipka Tartars, even into, say, the Napoleonic era. And so it was part, again, these were truly their own pagans in a broader sense. And some were Orthodox, by the way. It's not to say you're talking about pagans, literally, also because some of them, as you know, from Kazak times were mostly Jews. Many Jews from Central and Eastern Europe actually were, aside from the ones that sort of migrated from the southwestern European persecutions later in the Renaissance, they were actually from like the Khazaria, right? And that's actually an issue with some specific currents of Judaism that, of course, see the original tribes of Israel as the actual, genetic connection. Other Jews are more liberal as far as that is concerned, but some of them were Muslims, and some of these guys were mostly pagan, telling the truth when you talk about properly the Turkic nomads, but they would later, as you know, like the Mongols, convert to Islam, at least in this part of Eurasia, and some were Christian already, even before some, of course, before the Slav, the Rus were converted, right? So at some point in history, yes, there was a Christian Kazakh that fought against a pagan Slav, right? And who knows how it ended? Well, generally it ended worse for the nomad, but not always, unfortunately, for those Eastern Slavic settlers. Now, the presence of these Asiatic nomad horse archers was constant, right? There was no Russian army which light cavalry did not have a consistent part of these guys, right? In the top fix comment, I will insert like some links to properly other unit types that are sort of more generic, like Asiatic heavy and light cavalrymen, for example. But we have already seen them. We can appreciate them in that, constant facies, right? And here we are characterizing them a bit in Russian service, right? Now, the interesting aspect about what we said, for example, just right now about the Cossacks, is that poorer Russian noblemen sometimes served alongside the same Kazakhs in mixed units, right? This is so if these guys serve, like, what about the Russian peasants, right? In general, the Russian princes did not like to militarize their, the lower estates, and telling the truth, they didn't even have such strong control over the properly Eastern European hinterland, aside from they mostly ruled from trade centers along the great Russian riverways, right? And the Eastern Slavs had their own local militias, and they were also quite jealous again of their own meager possessions in the forests, etc. And again, a nomad would have thought twice before venturing into those forests, because that's where the Slavs would ambush them actually in quite atrocious fashion. But the idea that some of these commoners would at some point join, out of misery, out of just like thirst of adventure, right, and loot, because as we've seen, this was one of the greatest movers overall, is actually well found, right? You could have found among the same Kazakhs some, independent Kazakh war bands, some Slav that, in that sense, could have also, like, as the entire war band, come to serve a Rusian nobleman in turn. It sounds twisted, but actually it's pretty normal in this context. There is a great influence of this Western Eurasian steppe warfare in the same Rusian panoplies. We've observed it many times. The Rusian horsemen used, for example, the composite bow. That was the nomadic main weapon, had been, as you know, created with probably the intent of being used from a mobile platform that initially was when it was created, like the war chariot, as we were talking about just the other day, for Bronze Age warfare, and that remained, of course, in when cavalry proper was developed after that. All right, and the same goes, as we'll see, with other type of weapons, such as sabers, for example, that are, needless to say, dramatically useful on horseback. They cut like hell, and they, especially for type of cavalry that tends to avoid like properly frontal charges, because they are mostly light cavalry, right? And so they're just raiders. They can't pass by, I don't know, attacking like you see in movies, like a caravan, a village, like cutting on, and without stopping, right? Smelling the roses, let's say, and they're that wild and predatory, and they maximize their armament to obtain, like, of course, as always, the greatest effect with the minimum risk. Of course, the Kazakhs also engage into hand-to-hand combat, but as we've seen, the steppes tactics mostly entail like the fastest and the in running and shooting you are, and the more you can overwhelm the enemy and defend yourself. So lighter is actually being lighter, more likely equipped armor, and defended is actually the best form of defense, because it allows you to run faster, to get the hell out of the way more quickly. And this applies to, in fact, also some types of properly Rusian warfare rather than the Kazakh one specifically. All right. As we were saying before, Kazakh, again, we hear Cuman, Pecheneg, Kipchak, etc. also after the Mongols arrived. It's basically the same thing. If you are looking from probably the strictly, military prototype, they fight exactly the same way. They're barely distinguishable. At times, some of these people like acquire a ethnic superiority over the others, and so their name, whichever it was, like towers, also in the annals of history, but they also rise and fall quite quickly, and overall they're just some broader confederacies that include other groups, so it's all a vague terminology, and there is no need to be picky about them. So we can distinguish actually we can make some example. For example, let's talk a Cuman, right? These are models based primarily on archaeological evidence, right? And the locations are the kurgans, the 100 of burial mounds that are scattered, as you know, across Western Eurasia, right? The excavation of these graves provided us with relevant evidence, and mostly we have also the famous Bibles, like the statues that, even though very crudely, and there is all a sort of artistic evolution over time, indicate part of this mounds. They were also a very important point of reference to orient yourself in the steppes, that is literally just a flat land, and there is not much also with weather changing. It's a way to immediately recognize where you are, and that's how these people also organize the steppe in their own way. So overall, right, clothing consisted of boots, riding boots, obviously enough, trousers, a long under-tunic, split at front or sides, which facilitated riding. This is all the millennia-old steppe wisdom concerning mounted combat and the best way of keeping yourself. Of course, this gear does not have much of a defense per se. Most of these guys are technically unarmored, right? But add a kaftan, a short over tunic, and a cloak to that, and you have maybe some minimal protection against some of the hits, especially coming from the arrows that were pretty nasty if properly hitting at the right angle, if their energy had not spent itself, and therefore even with that relative equipment you could save yourself in part from some particularly severe wound. But don't bet on that. If you get dressed like that into an arrow exchange, you're lucky again if you're not hit, because the arrows are flying all around. You're gonna be hit, and mostly it's mass against mass, right? Out shooting the enemy and hoping that you're not the guy of the many that is going to fall anyway. It's a drama also if you do not have enough horses, for that matter, but at least if you are part of a greater company, at least you can take somebody else's horse and the one of the dead or whatever. The materials used are chiefly wool, brocade sometimes, so some of these guys are affluent, and in the steppes consider this wealth is carried with you, right? There is an ostentation, which is also reflected in part in Eastern European arms and armor that are very richly decorated at a point, because many of these people were just out there on the run. It's just like a Far East frontier, right, in which you are always on the move, right? Then you have Ford. There was a great traffic, right, of this this commodity that would make later on in the 16th century, after Timotheevich, that was the Russian Pizarro, would make up to 1/3 of the entire Tsar's income, like now gas does, gas and oil do. So pretty, raw material. Sometimes you have linen, silk. The latter, is very resistant. We still make, anti-projectile armor with silk, and it's extremely expensive also in the steppe, of course, and leather, right? This, of course, was like a bit the basis of, if you want, the clothing aspect and the materials that could be used. The elite would integrate this with actual metal armor, and so they would look pretty. They were much better defended, needless to say. But obstentating silk, for example, for one of the latter's guys, would have been, in that sense, typical, right? Because it was just a better way of protecting yourself, also in the non-metally armored parts of your body. There was in the steppe, due to this quite homogeneous appearance, if you want, a great emphasis placed on the colors, right? That depended on the wealth and social status of the wearer, for which we see, embroidery and trim, often fur, by the way, with particular colors that distinguish the clan, the tribe, the status. Of course, in part this was connected with the more costly the dye, and the deeper, sort of think about the purple in the Byzantine context. That's just also more expensive to produce, and so it had been acquiring historically that symbol, right? Needless to say, armor, gilded, etc. That is also you have sometimes this swords, the hilt encrusted with precious gems of sort. This is true all over Europe, for example. you don't really need to look at these guys that in fact have normally much poorer material culture in the first place. But again, for the steppe guy, the important is immediately recognizing if you're out there in a showdown, who you have in front, right? Quick ways to distinguish one another. That would have been a mystery for most Eastern Europeans at that point, but had a very specific, like immediate meaning for whichever of these guys, wherever they came from, recognizing themselves on that basis. Steppes weather is, as you know, extreme, for which the Kazak gear changed in part on the same basis. For example, the cloak was generally of fur in winter, otherwise of thick wool, right? Then it also depends where we're talking, what kind of thermic excursion exists between night and day, this kind of things, but generally speaking, this was noticed. Fur trimmed felt or woolen caps were also worn for like adding to that comfort. Like, it's not that the Kazakh was a particularly humanly sensitive person in general, both mentally and physically. I mean, roasting people alive, or kidnapping their women and chopping their babies to pieces is like, it's perhaps exactly not that kind of profile, like that they would identify themselves like, especially when they were selling some of their own relatives for sable fur or something. But again, they also lived in a traditional world that had sort of specific ideas. But let's say that the of course everything does, especially in preserving calories out there. So if you can, given that they were measuring carefully everything that they consumed, because they barely lived above the subsistency, like the survival rate of growth, like you really want to lesinate on the same unnecessary expenses. Even having a cap, of course, was part of that. It could be an important investment in this guy's lives. Quality armor was a matter of status, indeed, depended on the wealth of the individual, similarly to clothing. And we have really a wide variety. Generally speaking, we associate the steppe, even Eastern Europe in the sedentary part, like with lamellar, with scale even, but mail was also quite out there. It had been from quite some time. Let's say that the West, let's say Europe in general, had been spreading mail like crazy further east, and you actually find, we've seen it in the video about the Rus, a lot of Western European arms and armor, at least among the Slavic elite. All right, there were, and we will talk about this, foreign troops in the Rus by the 12th to 13th century. We're not talking just about the usual Scandinavians, especially from the Viking era that was a bit over, but at this point, for example, I don't know, German knights, right? You could find not so many. This is not like, I don't know, in Hungary or in other places that normally had knights coming from all of Western Europe. But someone so desperate to think to make a career out there, the material misery of the times has no limit, really, also in the more developed areas. And the steppe does imitate this. We've seen how the Khazars did look very much like, adopting sedentary gear. They were feudalizing, in a sense, fortifying before they were wiped out by the Rus. These distractions are relevant because, as we just said, there wasn't much surplus in the steppe. So before the rise of the Rus, at least the Khazars had managed to hegemonize an important amount of resources and sort of starting to build up over them. Think about, I don't know, even Sarai or certain centers later on, the Mongols, that were mostly based on this intercontinental trade. and in part the same Rusians had been, as we've seen with the great riverways, rather than being having a particularly interland capacity expansion. But whenever, in fact, the Senatory war takes over, like it crushes this avant-post, and the steppe comes back quickly into some sort of more nomadic reality. The Mongols really do not go easy on these Western Eurasian nomads themselves, so there is that further re-nomadization, even as a consequence of that. And that comes with much less armor in general for the average Kazakh horseman, let's call him like this. There was naturally also, in terms of material, leather, kilted fabrics, bone. You do have this sort of archaic ways of, again, protecting yourself out there. What could be typical? Like a sleeveless fur-trimmed lamellar corselet, right? Compact, like these guys are also not big, usually. And especially, well, okay, these heavier ones were sort of better fed, better selected in a way. But in that instance, for example, you will mostly invest on the torso, the protection, and also like wearing a helmet, or if you were affluent enough, that's mainly the duo that also in the Senatory war gets privileged. But there could be sometimes even just like a more dispersed metal armor, such as like studs and within a leather caftan, right, for the entire body, maybe with the metal studs concentrated also there in the more covering the more vital organs. It was always like that there is nothing particularly distinctive about this, if not, again, the primitiveness of it all, because at the end of the day, the ways you make armor are pretty much the same out there, right? Also for the Senatory war, right? Just in general, there is much less, and it's much poorer than the average final rank, I don't know, Eastern Slavic militiaman, right? And again, it was fine like this, because these guys had a horse they could run. They didn't have a better life than a sedentary peasant, but it was their way of finding a way through like a better, existence, and sometimes even settling down. Of course, there is an important demic sort of blending in the frontier between the Slavs and the Turks. The helmets, too, of course, came in a wide variety of shapes that we have documented in the video about Rusian warfare for the History of Warfare series. The most popular fashion among the Cumans was having a strip of silk bound turban-like around the helmet rim. This was also a mean of status display, right, of mean of recognition. Shields were, like normally in the steppe, small and circular. You didn't really need much more than that. They had to be light or made of wood, leather, or auxiliaries. However, in spite of, again, the essence of the steppe tactics being, as we were talking about before, like even lighter equipment, less protection, but more mobility for that matter, the Cumans also adopted a small version of the almond shield used by the Rus. Why is that? Well, in part it's just hybrid warfare. They came to use that because some, as we've seen, of them were also, just either serving the Rus or they were mixed blood or whatever. The point, however, is that if you are habituated to steppe warfare and you go fighting into the sedentary world, you need to be better protected anyway, right? So it's not that the Cuman would change dramatically his own panoply, also because usually people do not really do that, right? When you look at even ancient warfare, so you realize that mercenaries at large maintain their own armament out of just habit and functionality. Like if you're good at using that, even if there is a slightly unfavorable tactical situation. You can't get out of it better with something you rely on. It's something you have to learn to fight with for the occasion, right? So yes, there are, as always, arms and armor that are taken from the enemy, but that doesn't make for the majority of these guys. For the elite is a bit different, because the elite is always more international, but it also in this sense needs to have sort of the best equipment. So if, say, the Rus made better arms and armor, the Cuman elite wanted, just for being co-opted within the system, that, right? Also because in combat that would be useful for making their elite cavalry more effective. The almond shield existed in the Rus in a similar way, for which the almond sort of kidney shaped, actually a darker shield was present in Spain, right? The reason you need something a bit more compact, a bit more covering, for parrying like most of the blows. This is interesting because the Steppes guys had mostly the circular shield, because really blows can arrive from everywhere. We need this just more like as a general item that can help you a bit also into melee, but it's the minimal way of protecting part in that context. When the sedentaries instead cope with the steppes nomads that used to shower them with a lot of arrows, there is a need to widen and to render more complex, more effective in that sense, the shield shape, right? This can happen at different levels. So for example, the almond shield was something normally, say, not like a buckler, it could be something a bit larger, but it was fundamentally a smaller shield. Then all the peoples like from Eastern Europe to the Balkans that cope with the steppe missile fire have the need to essentially start developing larger types of shields for infantry, some sort of camping tables. For example, the Lithuanian pavis that appears in the sources even before the more famous Italian one is connected with this. And it's not even just like in none of these contexts that this shapes or formulas make a revolutionary or, oh my god, such an advanced type of shield. Like there are not so many ways you can make a shield. The point is, why do you use it? Why do you equip larger amount of troops with that? Well, in the case of the Slavs, especially the rectangular shape is to cover a bit better the corners that an oval shield that was still present, of course, in parallel wouldn't quite do, especially for the infantry. And not necessarily for the heavier one, on the contrary, like the heavies would have armor that covers, like say in the metal part, is better than a shield, and that's the same reason why, for example, also the say this Kazak elite does not have larger shields in the first place, because when they have the heavily armored elite, right, that is useless. That's why in the 13th century the Western shield, knightly shield, becomes smaller, triangular, the Byzantine cataphracts too. Like they don't have large shields because armor makes, first and foremost, it's rather the more lightly armored guy that needs that more extensive protection. Sometimes these shields are also weak, say they're not particularly strong, right? But the important is to cover, because again, of all these massive arrows shower, we'll see now how much a Kazakh could carry in terms of ammo. Like only a few arrows would actually be dangerous, right? And in fact, that's the reason why light cavalry as such is not decisive, because even if you keep showering the enemy with that, you can't break him just per se. You can soften him up, whatever, but if you don't have the heavies that in combined tactics smash into the enemy after, in fact, the lights have sort of adequately prepared him for giving way under that charge, it doesn't work. Right, admittedly, the heavies can't break either alone like that, but they are the punching force. They are the ones that must break or die fundamentally. So this is essentially why this type of shields are out there for the Cumans to be paradoxically, they say, in different reasons. Like for the Rus to be better protected for missile, for the Cumans too, but also because they could put up a better defense in melee, so mostly for hand-to-hand combat, rather than in which they could find themselves more easily in Rusian service than because they fought against heavier opponents than protecting from a missile that also these shields of course were designed for. Right. The nomads did not use spurs. This is another detail that there were spurs, but they tendentially wouldn't, because they controlling the horse instead by the use of a small whip known as the nahai, carried looped around the wrist, was sort of more practical. Right, there were a number of ways that were connected with, for example, the high knee riding technique. Essentially, these guys sort of tended to become smaller, to contract themselves, not to expose the limbs too much, because of all that RO5 we were saying before on horseback. And these are things that you find even in some, for example, the Magyar knights, even by this point, the 13th century, which they were fully westernized, they still sometimes are represented in the ancient Magyar fashion with the high knee, right? And so the spur, at least in the typical way that was used, couldn't quite fit immediately that say the same functionality. Of course it could, but it was easier for the guy to of the steppe to sort of stimulate the horse. Also, in more, you see, the spur is also a relatively rough way of doing so. The whipping that these men were habituated to subministrate to their mounts was sort of more refined, complex. These horses were, of course, very good for that light type of engagement, and so they had also to be more specifically jumping around with different commands, etc., which, the Western heavy knight had just to spur the horse to charge, right? Fundamentally, in a frontal way, that these guys had to be sort of much more sophisticatedly indicating the horse what kind of directions to take. It was all an art that unfortunately is lost together with most of these people's traditions, but it was quite a thing out there, and pretty typical through this instrumentation, right? So, speaking of offensive weapons, composite bows, we already said that, especially because a lot of the actual combat takes place at a distance. However, the light lance was also needed, and also the lighter horsemen had that, right? So they weren't typically thought to just engage the enemy at close distance, if not during the pursuit, and so they relied mostly on the bow in that sense. But they would have say, I explained this, heavy and light depends when defining units of how they usually take on each other. If there is not a heavier armored horseman, you can charge into a guy that is your same lightness, you're going to act as heavies in that specific context. So at least in the way of life of these people, normal, they knew how to engage into hand-to-hand combat. It's a light lance, it doesn't have to penetrate, say, particularly hard targets. So it's obvious that, in fact, the prevalent use is for softer ones, but it's still really important. Then the saber, for the aforementioned cutting capacity. You see among the Rus themselves, Turkic sabers that are quite, let's say, culturally adopted. Even though, let's stress that the Russian elite really was looking forward to Western European imports rather than the saber that was lighter. In at least you can have a heavy saber, but tendentially, like the saber is the degree by which the poverty of the average nomad is really doing. So yes, there were some massive blades that could, damage armor like crazy, but overall, right, for the type of tactics that the Rus was developing, it was heavy cavalry and trying to imitate the Western one to that heavier degree, and they needed the same equipment for properly smashing armor. Reason for which we do find in the steppe always showing us that there was a degree of armor, maces or kistians. These were in the Turkic world very important because they indicated command of some sort, and the theory was that every true man had to initiate himself to warfare by running, in order to become a man proper. So you're younger, you don't have armor, you're light, you're fast. Also, biologically speaking, like, you feel much more the physicality in this world, like properly in the various ages. You're all one with your horse in many ways, and you have essentially to aggress an enemy opponent, a heavier one, so to prove that you're better and that you do not need armor because you're spiritually superior. You have to do things like, pulling the guy's horse tail, like literally the tail of the horse, like not his hair. You have hopefully to kill him, of course, but and you need an anti-armor weapon in that circumstance, also showing again that you can come close to the enemy, because maces are normally used by armored troops, right? So there's this crazy idea around, but the mace was always carried, at least among, like, it could be also a small mace, nothing particularly, powerful and bludgeoningly speaking, but it could be useful against also softer targets if small, right? Then you would have a lasso, typically known as the arcan. This was quite useful to, for example, if you had surrounded an enemy, like simply taking him down at the distance by enveloping him like that. Of course, there wasn't not a very practical way of using a lasso in combat, right? Especially for the lighter troops. And these guys live as cattle breeders anyway, so they need it for the animals. And humans are no different. You have javelins, which is yet another indicator of some closer combat and anti-armor capabilities, by the way. Never think again about the steppe as solely like ultralight, like especially also here at the fringe of the sedentary world context, which like the uttermostly poorest guys are in Central Asia, right? And yes, you can find this type of trooper up to there, as we said at the beginning, but there are lots of things in between, not just steppe, right? And in any case, these guys were hired also by other peoples, so they adequated themselves in their murderous means, right, to engage also heavier enemies. Javelins are 3-4 in numbers, let's say. They would be carried behind the saddle. Speaking of the number of arrows carried by the individual horsemen, this is true in part also by the heaviest. Right, there is some reminiscence of the fact that, not just traditionally, all the elite knew perfectly well, not just in the nomadic world, by the way, to use bow on horseback. If anything, they hunted often and so on. But like there is of the kind of heroic hybrid between the shock knight that can, however, still engage the distance with arrows. And given especially the fact that, again, a bow and some arrows are not that complicated to carry, right? Something more widespread than you may think. Some Ruthenian knights do the same, by the way. Of course, arrows cost, especially in the steppe, if you consider the fact that a Mongolian host could shoot with, seen it in the video about Mongolian logistics, like up to, even 1.5 million arrows in a single battle. Like you have the idea of how much, like how many forests were destroyed, like in the process of producing these projectiles. Arrows were quite precious, even if there were so many around, because again, these guys are really poor and they can't afford to waste them, so they would take them out. There were particular ways to preserve the shafts, to readjust, like also the head, because everything would do, right? So it's been estimated that, say, every of these Kazakh warriors would carry something between 70 and 100 arrows, which makes you understand already that like 10 people can arrive to carry 1,000 arrows, which is insane, apparently. But as I was saying before, it's all a crazy, not mad minute, but mad hour in shooting all the stuff as quickly as you can to power your enemy, because that's the best defense you have out there as a light. This ammo would be distributed in a leather bow case that would hang at the left of the horseman, with 20, 30 arrows inside, and the quiver on the right containing possibly 50, 60 arrows. Furthermore, at times, more than one quiver could be carried, which means that, again, the number could go consistently higher, and this tells you again how many of these arrows could be shot, and also how sort of ineffective against heavier targets overall they were, and so how miserable after all this steppe horseman's life really is, aside from the elite, but as a general military system. They could be, again, dramatically useful for skirmishing, for hitting an armored opponent, like as they were themselves. So everything was created in the steppes, and you could really, it was mostly about the psychological effect. We know it very well that when the sedentaries were attacked by the steppes people, like the most difficult thing of all was sitting there under the constant arrow hail that wouldn't actually cause that much damage, even though you had to be careful to be well protected enough, but that wouldn't end. Together with the attacks of these guys, you would never know until the actual elite came in if that was just an engagement that could last 1 hour or 3 days. And that's how the enemy would normally try to, of course, attract the nomads would try to attract their opponents on a difficult ground, wearing them out even for days, because it's not a proof of strategic superiority, it's quite the contrary, right? You have to wear him out constantly until you can hope to send in the heavies that sometimes may not even have the entire force to wipe out a substantially heavier army like the sedentary one from the field, right? So it's very complicated. We've seen this stuff for the Battle of Manzikert. We have appreciated how, again, in fact, these essentially Central Asian tactics are spreading, and they are normally said, oh my god, they're so terrible things, look at what later the Mongols or the Ottomans did. But at the end of the day, the actual success that came from actually more advanced armies in general, properly led, etc. It's not much in this technique. It's in the general moral forces involved, and how you handle the battle lines, and you succeed in fact in pulling off like quite a feat, right? Given that, again, the sedentary war did not give way, right? It could be, especially in the case of the Rus, could be shattered by the Mongol invasion, it could be undergoing severe crisis, but let's be honest, the Mongols were always in the steppes, and that's where they remain. Especially in this context, right? Not even like dynasties that installed themselves in Europe, right? That didn't really happen. But imagine the spectacle, the terrifying one of all these, like say 10,000 of these guys, because they were available in large numbers. And so if you say, I don't know, there is a 30,000 man army, like it, if you consider the heavies being 1/3 and another third being this auxiliary, you realize 10,000 men could have, I don't know, as we just observed, 1 million arrows with themselves, which is insane, right? And again, we don't have to exceed with the availability of these resources. Like there would be like quite an industry behind these arrow supplies, as you can imagine, but not everybody would be out there with 100 arrows available, right? And also the quality, you can imagine being relatively low, right? Weapons have to be good enough, right? They don't have to be excellent, but of course a Kazakh knows how to replenish gradually his arsenal by himself in the wilderness, right? Even though there are some centers that help like to collectively replenish these forces, especially in the inconvenience of a general advance, with consistent numbers, say for raiding and etc. So these arrows were not to be shot all at the time, and you can imagine how they would be depleted along the way, considering that the first reaction on this horseman was simply shooting arrows. And to simply, again, psychologically frighten the enemy, even though the say potential of physical damage was quite limited, right? Naturally, there was their fair share of Rus that were killed by these weapons. It's not even just about causing immediately like much damage, but as you know, infecting the wounds at Similia. There were all ways to poison arrowheads, etc. But there is no such thing like a super weapon, right? It solves magically all the problems. And again, overall, it's just fighting like this is a declaration of inferiority. So the extra quivers could be slung from the belt, baldric, or saddle. The bow case normally had a small pouch containing spare bowstrings that was yet, the other eventuality, like playing a guitar without strings. And there was also a balance among the various items you took with yourself. Like they knew how to use, of course, their bows, how to stress them, when to replace the same strings, passing from a weapon to another, using multiple ones simultaneously, in a combined fashion at least, was all part of these guys' training that was just acquired because if you were alive in that world, it's because you had gone through the test and you had survived and somebody hadn't, right? So it was that brutal, and that's why these people were naturally seen in part also as savages. But there is again an important connection, especially with the Rus, with the long-standing relations, ambiguous ones, unstable ones, but still wanted to bring to a hybridation of warfare, and that never quite can be underappreciated in the overall account of military economics, if you can so say. So this is pretty much it. Naturally, I'm glad I stopped counting how many steppes warfare videos I've made to this point, but it's really cool that we managed to this point to cover so much about this world, right? A bit from here, a bit from there, units, tactics, general warfare, armies, organizations of different peoples too, because really it's a matter of like properly familiarizing with them, familiarizing with the type of with the military, single military culture. Here I have 56 videos about steppes warfare, assuming that I remember to, like, I do it every time I upload the video, but to allocate all the actual videos on the topic in it, right? There is so much stuff I should actually re-upload about other, here and there. We have really an important amount so far, and I'm glad again we continue to add them. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.